we can make a start. So big welcome to everyone today. Thank you for joining. Great to see so many people joining us today from all different parts of the world. Feel free to use the chat function on this meeting to introduce yourself and tell us where you're joining us from and maybe what industry you work in. That'd be really nice to see. My name is James, and I'm the course advisor here at the University of Manchester for our online data analytics and social statistics course. A few of you may have already spoken to me before, a few of you may have even applied for the course before, and a few of you may be new to this. So feel free to get in touch with me. I'll give my contact details out at the end of this event. And if you're interested in studying online with the University of Manchester, you can reach out to me and I'm happy to give you some more information about that. In today's event, we're going to be talking about open data. So the title of today's event is Trace the Future, Unlocking Social Insights from Open Data. And I'm really happy to be joined by our two panelists today. So we have Dr. Alex Chernat, who is our course director for our data analytics and social statistics course. He's also a senior lecturer at the University of Manchester, and he'll be talking to you a little bit about open data. I'm also joined by Dr. Gaughan, who's a research associate at the Kathy March Institute for Social Research at the University of Manchester, and he'll also be talking to you today about some of his research work. So I'll just hand over to those two today just to introduce themselves a little bit more and provide a bit more information about who they are. So Alex, start with you.
Yeah, hello everyone. So my name is Alex. I'm a senior lecturer in social statistics at the University of Manchester, and also I help run and kind of help develop the master's program in data analytics and social stats. So my background is in survey methodology. So I do lots of work with surveys, so applying questionnaires, collecting data from the population, usually with large probability surveys, but also with different types of surveys around the world. And I mostly do methodological work. So I try to understand how good is this data, how can we collect it better, how can we improve it? And also I'm looking into how to connect different types of data. So how to connect survey data with biological data, with Twitter data, social media, sensor, and so on. That's kind of my background.
Brilliant, thank you for that, Alex. And Connor.
Yeah, hello everyone, I'm Connor Gaughan. I've recently joined the University of Manchester as a postdoctoral researcher. I've been here for a few months now. My background is in political science, but I did my master's in data science and my PhD kind of combined the two together. So I do a lot of work with, I do a lot of political research, but looking at how we can incorporate digital data from social media and other places to better understand kind of social and political questions. And I'm now currently a postdoctoral research associate on a similar project, on the same project as Alex, which I'll be talking about a little bit today.
Brilliant, thank you, Connor. Yeah, looking forward to hearing about that research. So yeah, today we're going to be talking a little bit about open data and digital footprint data in the social research fields. As Connor mentioned there, he'll also be talking about the project he's been working on as part of the Smart Data Research UK scheme. We'll also open it up to questions. So once Connor's given his presentation, we'll go through some of the questions that you've asked. So please feel free to post any questions that you have in the Q&A function, or you can even post them in the chat function if you prefer that. Either way works, and we'll make sure we get to answer those for you. And then I'll finish up by discussing our online study options here at the University of Manchester, particularly in the field of data analytics and social statistics. So if you find some of the things interesting today in today's talks, it could be a great opportunity for you to learn more about these by studying it yourself here at the University of Manchester with our online master's program. So I'll just hand over to Alex first. If you'd like to maybe give us a bit of an introduction on what is open data, what's a digital footprint, and how maybe that translates into some of the research work that you do here at the University of Manchester.
Yeah, sure. So data comes in different formats. So we have traditional data like surveys where we go and ask people questions, we collect this data and then we analyze it. There are other types of data. A general term would be digital trace data. This kind of overlaps with big data or digital footprint data and so on. So these are data that are collected in the process of interacting with digital devices. So for example, when you work with your computer or your phone, you would, for example, leave a trace of all the apps you used, all the websites you visited. The phone would collect information on you, for example, on the amount of noise where you are or GPS location. So all of these data are data that can be used. So commercial companies use them, I know, for targeting advertising, but academics are also kind of considering how can we use this to do academic research and understand how the world works. And then there's other types of data like the census, where we try to get information about everyone in the population. There's administrative data, for example, where we have data from government agencies in the way they interact with the public. And the way we access this data is quite different. So there are some data that are very restrictive. So it's very hard to get access to administrative data. You can imagine it shouldn't be easy to get access to your tax returns or your medical records. The same with census, very sensitive data, very hard to get access to them. So there are ways in which you can use such data for research, but it's usually very restrictive. So you might need to go in a environment where you can't get your phone or a memory stick, and you can only access a server and only get some information out of that. So that's a very restrictive environment. Then we have some data where it's easier to get access to, but you probably still need to respect some rules and register and kind of agree to certain behaviors with that data. So for example, you can go to the UK Data Archive and download some surveys that you're going to use for your research. And those are kind of public data in the sense that you can go and access it, but they're not really open because you need to register. In principle, they're de-anonymized, so you can't identify people, but still they're kind of can be more sensitive. And if you put multiple data sets together, it might still be possible to identify people. And then we have really open data where you think, well, this data can't really identify anyone, or there's no risk that I can find somebody's income, or if they have a certain type of disease. And some of these are very aggregate, so you can get the GDP of a country over the last 100 years, or you could get some aggregates about COVID in different regions in the UK. But the idea would be, how can we get some of this data, like a survey data, and make it available to be more easy accessible? So maybe you don't need to sign lots of different agreements to get access to it, and how to make sure that it's useful, but also you can't identify people. So this is kind of where we are. And at the same time, there's this trend where people are looking at multiple data sets together. And this is kind of exciting because you could combine sensor data or digital trace data or things like social media with surveys. So you can really do interesting research, but then it's easier to identify people. It's more sensitive. So there's this trade-off between doing kind of exciting research, playing with nice data, and then being careful with privacy and anonymity. And part of this project where Connor is also involved is trying to kind of figure out how to do this, where we have survey and digital trace data and try to make it open, but anonymous, but still useful. So try to find kind of this balance. And I think Connor can give a little more detail about how that goes.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, Connor, if you'd like to share some insights from your research, or if you can share your slides as well, if you want to bring that up now, feel free to tell us a little bit more about what you've been working on.
Yeah, great. So can you guys see the screen? Yeah. Awesome. Okay. Yeah, so just building on a little bit about what Alex discussed. So yeah, I'm a postdoctoral research associate. I'm on the same project as Alex. It's the DIGSURV project. And primarily it's about how we can link digital footprint or digital trace data with survey data and then make that safely accessible for open research. So just starting off with a little bit of background about myself and how I got into this project. As I mentioned, I have a background in political science. I actually studied here at the University of Manchester in 2015. I then graduated in 2018 and then moved down to Devon to complete my master's in applied social data science at the University of Exeter. And then I completed my PhD in political science at the University of Southampton in 2024. And then returned to the University of Manchester at the end of December of 2024 as a postdoctoral research associate on the DIGSURV project with Alex and a few of the members from political science, computer science, and political communication. So, as Alex has already touched upon, the project is primarily focused on how we can link traditional survey data with digital trace data. So, in quantitative social and political research, we tend to consider survey data as the kind of gold standard in quantitative political and social research. However, this has often meant as social scientists, we're relying almost exclusively on self-reported measures when we seek to understand a lot of important issues relating to human attitudes and behaviours and social networks. But we are going through this era of a kind of explosion in new data sources driven by the digital revolution. And that has meant survey research is being pushed into a kind of new era of development where we can link survey data with other forms of observed or digitally generated data. One of the fastest growing areas of which is this augmentation of survey data with digital trace data or DTD. So as Alex has already mentioned a little bit about what digital trace data actually is, very broadly, my slides are not, there we go, been a bit laggy. Digital trace data tends to refer to data that individuals leave behind as a result of their interactions with a wide range of digital technologies. So that can include social media activity, web browsing data, mobile and app usage. It can involve online transactions. It can involve traditional communication data like emails and chat logs and call records. It can also involve sensor data, so things like smart home devices or information we can get from wearable trackers like smartwatches and Fitbits. And also it can involve data from streaming and media consumption. So viewing history on Netflix, YouTube, Amazon Prime, data from our listening history on Spotify. There's a whole range of different pieces of information that we can gather from digital trace data. So the purpose of DIGSURV is primarily to investigate the feasibility of producing data sets for open research that can integrate individual level survey data with these newer forms of digital trace data. So how can we link somebody's survey responses to their social media activity or their online transaction data or their web browsing information? How can we do that and make it available for open research? So the reason why this is so difficult to do, open research generally relates to how research is performed and how knowledge is shared based on the principle that research should generally be as open as we possibly can. Part of that open data access is a fundamental principle of good and ethical research. We want to promote wider transparency and accessibility of our research. We want to increase visibility and impact, and we also want to encourage greater collaboration within the scientific community. So open data sharing is a major part of that. However, unlike survey data, which is typically anonymized when you receive the data, openly sharing digital trace data can, more often than not, place researchers in violation of different confidentiality agreements. It can put you in violation of national or international data protection laws. And a lot of times it can actually put you in violation of the usage terms of the digital platforms themselves. Even more importantly, a lot of digital trace data, especially social media data, is inherently identifiable. So when we link that with survey data, it becomes even more problematic because this can de-anonymize the survey responses, which are likely to contain a lot of very sensitive information. So the general aim of DIGSURV is how can we as researchers who work with digital trace data, and especially those working with digital trace data to survey linkage, how can we resolve the conflict between good data compliance and good open access? So the solution we propose as part of the DIGSURV project that I'm working on at the moment, we want to create a standardized process for the generation of anonymized variables from the digital trace data, which we can then safely link to survey data and make available for open research so that other researchers can use that data as well. we're trying to bridge the gap between open research and data compliance. So how can we make the DTT securely anonymous whilst maintaining as much of the data's utility as possible? Because of course, one of the obvious ways you can anonymize data is you just aggregate it or you summarize it, but then you lose a lot of the underlying data, which is valuable. So we do this by using two pre-existing proof of concept data sets, which contain linked survey to digital trace data. So the first data set that we're working with at the moment contains linked survey to social media data, specifically Twitter data. And then the second data set we're working on contains linked survey to respondent web browsing data. So my specific role as the postdoc on this project is to utilize a range of different computational and statistical methods to elicit new variables from the digital trace data that we can then safely link with the survey data and make available to other researchers. So just to briefly introduce you to the data sets that we're working with, at the moment, I've only managed to work on the first data set. The data set 2 will be later down the line. This project's still in its early phase. But the first data set contains previously linked survey data with respondent Twitter / now X data during the US presidential campaign in 2020. So it was a two-wave YouGov panel study. The first wave was fielded to over 5,000 respondents in the run-up to the election between the 16th of September and the 20th of October. And then the second wave was fielded in the week following the election on the 9th of November. The dataset contains survey responses from participants relating to a set of socio-demographic, attitudinal and behavioural variables. And then these respondents, we then asked them to share their Twitter handle with us. And 1,598 respondents agreed to in the pre-election wave, which was about 27% of the overall sample. And then we collected all of the Twitter data of those 1,598 respondents. So we gathered all of their Twitter profiles, their tweet timelines, the accounts they follow, the tweets they liked, and the profiles and timelines of the accounts that they were following during the period leading up to the US election and then the week after the election finished. So just to give you a kind of illustration of what the survey to Twitter X kind of data linkage structure looks like, if you see the table on the left, that's our pre-anonymized survey data that contains, demographic, attitudinal and behavioral variables of all of our respondents. Within there, you've got you have a unique respondent ID for each respondent. And then if you move over to the right, you've got all of their Twitter X digital trace data. So you've got their user profile data, you've got their timelines, their likes, and then you have their follow networks, and then you also have all of the account profiles and timelines of the accounts they follow. Our job is to try and anonymize all of that digital trace data of their Twitter information so that we can safely link that to the survey data without exposing who that person is and then de-anonymizing the survey data, which is, of course, a serious data protection breach. So to give you a flavour of the kind of work that we're doing as part of this project, we've drawn up a preliminary list of variables that we've divided into 3 different categories. So firstly, we have a set of structural variables. So these are core anonymous variables that can broadly describe the general content and structure of a respondent's digital data. So this can include just general high-level metrics like how long have they been on Twitter, how many followers do they have, how often do they post, what times of the day do they post, what kind of category post types do they use mostly? Do they post mostly original tweets? Are they mostly retweets? How often do they use attachments in their tweets? And what's the average kind of general level of engagement each of their posts gets? So these are very high-level variables that are anonymous, but can describe a little bit about how they use Twitter and how people engage with them. We can also derive more complex variables from this data, such as post topics. So what do they talk about? How formal is their profile? How toxic is their content? What's the general sentiment of their posting? What's the general credibility of their follow networks? What's their general influencer status? So this is where we'd employ more complex statistical and computational methods, maybe like natural language processing or machine learning, to estimate these more complex measures. Second level would be more substantive variables. So these are more complex sets of additional variables that can estimate or measure key political concepts, attitudes, or behaviors. So this might involve estimating whole new variables of interest based on these digital indicators. So for example, can we get an estimate of ideological position based on their tweet content? Can we get an estimate of their populist position based on what they're talking about, who they engage with? Can we get an idea of the candidates or the policies that they endorse? Can we get a measure of their political attention? Can we generate estimates of how much misinformation they're exposed to? So these are the kinds of things that we can pull out of the digital data without making the data itself, available in its raw format. And then finally, we also draw up a set of validation variables, which I think is very interesting when you link to the survey data. There are some variables that exist in both the survey data and the digital data in some form, where we can then use one to validate the other. So, for example, there are questions we ask in the survey that relates to their media consumption and the ideological diversity of the accounts they follow. Can we actually look at what they've self-reported in the survey and correlate that with what's actually in their digital data to get an idea of how closely those two things correspond? So, for example, how often they claim to use Twitter, or how often they post on Twitter. We can actually validate that based on their Twitter data, as well as things like their perceptions of misinformation exposure, filter bubbles, or their self-reported ideological position. So these are the kinds of things that we can look at and we can derive from the digital data without making the digital data, the underlying data itself, available, but we can still provide some data which is informative and, substantively interesting. So just to give you some examples of what that would look like. So for structural variables, as I've mentioned, maybe we can pull out their post topics. So we can maybe use a topic model to understand if they're talking mostly about politics, sport, music, general life. We can look at, from a substantive perspective, maybe we can get estimates of left-right ideological position based on their follower networks, based on the content they engage with. Do they follow more right-wing accounts? Do they follow more left-wing accounts? What can that tell us about their ideological position? Or from a validation perspective, maybe we can look at, for example, something like a filter bubble or an echo chamber effect. How ideologically diverse are their follower accounts? We could look at maybe privacy paradox. So we do ask in the survey, for example, how much they are concerned about their data privacy. How does that correspond with how much sensitive information they're actually giving away in their digital profiles? And these are the kinds of things that we can get at in the digital data, and these are the kinds of questions that we can answer without, again, making the digital data itself available at the underlying level, which is problematic. So finally, we haven't started on data set 2 yet, because we haven't got that far into the project, but we're hoping to essentially replicate what we've done for data set 1 with data set 2. There we go. So again, we'll look to repeat the same process for linkage with a second form of DTD, which is web browsing data. This was a data set that was collected by YouGov in the UK for mobile devices between the 20th of March and the 21st of May 2020. This includes URLs visited by participants that have been classified as news navigation and are only available at the domain level. And it also contains information about referral apps. So we have ideas of not only the kinds of news sites that people were visiting, but also what they were looking at prior to visiting that website. So do they go from, a social media site like Facebook and then go and visit the BBC, for example? And again, we're looking to repeat the process of variable generation and anonymization to see how this procedure can translate from other forms of DTD beyond just social media. So to conclude, what we're trying to get at as part of the DIGSURV project, we know that the rise of new digital sources of information and their linkage with conventional survey data can give us, as social scientists, access to a wide array of new sources of insight into human behaviour and attitudes. But it also brings with it a host of methodological and ethical challenges when it comes to sharing this data with the wider research community. So what we're trying to do as part of the DIGSURV project is actively look to build a standardized process for generating anonymized variables from that digital trace data that are still substantively insightful and useful to other researchers, but can still be securely shared alongside participant survey data. And in doing so, we're hoping to establish better data sharing practices among researchers working with digital trace data to improve openness and transparency within the scientific community. So I hope that's given you a flavour of the work that we're doing as part of the DIGSURV project. And of course, if you have any questions or any follow-ups, then feel free to drop in the chat, or you can drop me an email and I'll be happy to answer any questions you've got. And I'll hand back to James.
You're muted, James.
Thank you for that, Connor. That was really interesting and really comprehensive in that short space of time as well. So thank you for sharing all that. That was really good. We have had a question come through, so feel free to please post any questions that you have. You can use the chat or the Q&A. We've got our first question that's come through there about what's been the most surprising aspect of your research so far, Connor?
I think perhaps the kind of the size of the data, I guess, is probably is the most surprising aspect. Working with Twitter data, it's very multidimensional. I don't know if anyone in the chat has had any experience of working with online data and especially social media data in the past, but the sheer volume of the data that you can extract from the internet, and then the kinds of things that it can tell you and the kinds of fields and dimensions you can pull out of that is really quite overwhelming. But I think it also shows how valuable the information is, but equally how important it is that we actually anonymize that data, because there's so much in there that could be used to identify a person. So it's been surprising the challenges that we face as researchers in terms of how do we actually make, as great as the digital data is and as insightful as it can be, how do we then kind of narrow that down and make it safe to actually make available and linked to survey data? It's probably been the most surprising aspect, but it is still early days. I'm sure there'll be a few more surprises as the project goes along, but yeah.
Great stuff, thank you. Some nice positive feedback there. Is there a question in there that's on? Okay, so there's a question about consent here. So you look to have consent from the survey respondents to link to their DTD data, but this can only be done if you get consent up front. How do we address that for linkage of surveys, DTS in general? Consent is so important. So question about consent there.
So I think Alex works a little bit with data with bias when it comes to linkage, which is an interesting question in itself. I don't know if Alex has got some thoughts on that.
Yeah, so normally the process, there are different designs for this kind of data. So often people work with surveys and people give a consent to say, oh, I'm going to participate in the survey. Other people use just social media data, and then you can sometimes just scrap the data because it's online. When you put these two together, actually, it can be a little more complicated, like Vanessa mentions there. So one design is you start with the survey, and then at the end of the survey, you might ask people, well, are you willing to donate the data? Then you can have multiple steps. It's like, oh, are you willing? Then can you give us the ID so we can identify you? And then you also actually have to give an approval so we can use the data long term and archive it and make it available to others. So there's like a process through which you give this consent. And of course, not everyone gives consent. So you might have, 10%, 15% of people that agree to give you that. This is only of people that actually have that type of data, because we also need to remember that, maybe, I don't know, Connor, what's the Twitter or X usage these days? Is it 5-10% of the population that has that, and then 10% of that might agree to actually give the details to you? Then, maybe half of those actually manage to link the data. So you end up, this data is actually quite a small subset out of the big survey. And Connor mentioned that part of it is trying to understand this process. Who has Twitter, who's willing to give you the consent, how many people we manage to actually link the data and use it afterwards. So we have some procedures, so we need to be very thorough to get the consent if we want to link these two sources together. And for me, this is surprising. There are lots of literature for surveys and digital trace data on their own, but kind of limited when you put them together. And this is something that we still need to figure out. I don't know, Connor, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think what's great is, I did my PhD on purely just Twitter data. So I studied a lot of Twitter data as part of my PhD, but we didn't actually link it with any survey data. And that raises an even bigger consent question, because if you wanted to look at the usage of, if you wanted to look at Twitter data at a very broad level, like millions of users, how do you gather consent from Twitter users if you're looking at, if you don't know who these people are? So at least with Twitter, with social media or digital trace data linkage with survey data, you can gather the consent as part of the survey. So you have that consent in advance. I think so. The linkage with survey to DTD does kind of help to address one of the issues when people just use Twitter digital trace data. Gathering consent can be a lot more difficult. So actually linking it, although you do get low consent rates, at least you can get informed consent up front before you start analyzing digital trace data, which not everyone can get if you just study digital trace data on its own, which I think is interesting.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you for that. There was another question about challenges you face in the research. So what's been some of the biggest challenges you face, and what did you do to overcome them?
I think so far, just again getting grips, kind of what I said before, getting to grips with the data itself and the size of the data. And again, if anyone's ever worked with digital trace data, a lot of it can be quite messy. It's very large and it's very messy, and it can take a lot of time to get to grips with that data, clean that data, get it into a format that you need it to be in. It can take a lot of time. It can be very time consuming. And also, again, with social media data, a lot of textual data, for example, a lot of it's got a lot of embeddings in it. You've got emojis, you've got hashtags, you've got messy words. So it can be very hard just from a data cleaning perspective. Before you even start doing any analysis, you've already got the issue of how do I actually get a hold of this data and make it usable to actually do the things that I want to do before you can even start thinking about generating variables and all that kind of stuff. So actually, I'm only just in the process of generating variables now because it's taken so long to kind of get to grips with the data in itself. So just from that perspective, I just think the sheer volume and the kind of complexity of the data has probably been the biggest challenge so far. But again, overcoming it has just been taking my time and just figuring out the best tools and methods that you can use to kind of work with large scale data.
Absolutely, yeah. No, most of working with data is cleaning it, unfortunately, isn't it? Rather than actually doing the fun stuff and analyzing it. And yeah, I imagine social media data just being, yeah, endless amounts of sorting of that. So I had a question actually. I was wondering, so with your study with the survey data that you found, did you find like the survey responses matched up with people's behavior on Twitter? Did people have a good understanding of themselves, or did you find there was quite a big disconnect there?
Oh, I haven't actually managed to do that analysis yet,
Okay.
but that is down the line. We're looking at there's a big question we're really, really interested in is this kind of idea of like measurement bias and how much does self-reported data link up to what people are actually doing. And I think this is one of the biggest value adds of linkage with survey data to digital trace data. We know a lot about what people do online based on what they tell us they do, but what they actually say they do in a survey and what they actually do, I suspect there's a big disconnect there. It's kind of the say-do gap of what people say and what they actually do. And I think linking the data in this way gives us this great opportunity to actually assess that and go, okay, people are telling us that they're on Twitter for 6 hours a day and they're posting all the time. How does that actually correspond with what we know they're actually doing? And again, with the web browsing data for data set 2, again, they're telling us that they're looking at all these different news websites. Are they actually doing that? What are they actually looking at? And then it can be used to kind of address these questions in the future of measurement bias in surveys themselves. How much kind of do people actually match up what they're saying to what they're actually doing? And again, I don't know if Alex has got anything to add here because he works a lot on like bias and in surveys and how we can use this sort of stuff to address those questions.
Yeah, I mean, we have a couple of papers looking at this, and it's kind of concerning. For some of them, we found a correlation of 0 between what's in the digital trace data and what's in the survey. So it depends on the topic and how you measure it, but it was surprising and kind of depressing. And also you'd think, well, maybe we should trust the digital trace more, right? Because that actually measures precisely. But we have a paper where we had survey and digital trace data, what people did on their phone and computer, but also we had data from Facebook. So we actually linked their real Facebook data with this. And we could use the Facebook data that actually knows, for example, how much you use Facebook as a way to validate both data sets. We actually found that there are subgroups where the survey data is better than the digital trace data. So there was a group, maybe a third of the sample, where in the survey they said, oh, I use Facebook all the time, but in the digital trace data, it appeared they weren't using it. And when we looked at the real Facebook data, actually they were using Facebook all the time. So it's an example where the survey is more trustworthy than the digital trace data. And what we found, a big explanatory variable, is how many devices do you track? So if you track only one device, you might be missing people's behavior, right? Because we use computers, phones, lots of different devices. You can turn off these trackers, you can have VPN, you can have different ways in which you can, hide your behavior as well. So again, it's not always clear which of these gives you the best quality. So there's a difference between them. There's methods in which you can correct for it. And I think, like Connor was saying, the exciting part is for us to try to figure out what's the sweet spot. How can we combine this? When should we try the digital trace data? When should we trust and collect the survey data? So that's still kind of an open question, I think.
Great stuff, thank you. There's another question about the digital trace data and anonymization of that. So was there any, is there any data you found that particularly put that anonymization at risk from the digital trace data? Was there particular, data from Twitter behaviors that, would give away someone's identity in some way?
So you have the very obvious ones, which is if you take someone's Twitter profile or Facebook profile or whatever it is, some people will just have their profile picture and their name and their location. So you have very clear, personally identifiable information that you kind of just have to get rid of because it's too obvious. But then when you even anonymize at the highest level and you go, okay, we'll just get rid of any clearly identifiable information, you have these concerns around, you might have individual pieces of information that are not identifiable in and of themselves, but if you combine it with enough stuff and then you combine it with the survey data, suddenly you've got enough small pieces of information that you can actually maybe start to identify people. If you've got enough small pieces, you can put the kind of puzzle together and you can figure out who it is. So that's a problem. And then also you have issues with granularity or extreme outliers. So there's anything where if someone has a particular tweet that has like 150,000 likes, it's so extreme that it's like, well, actually, there's not many tweets out there that have that many likes. And suddenly you can identify people where you've got extreme values, or if you have really granular level data. So, for example, if you made available the exact date and time to the second that tweet was posted, again, you could potentially find someone out that way because it's such a specific number that somebody could, in theory, identify them from that data. So it's just trying to flatten out as much of that as possible and find as much of that as you can. But again, it's that kind of trade-off with, we want to anonymize it as best we can and make sure this is safe to release, but not kind of sanitizing it so much that there's nothing left to make available. So it's trying to find that sweet spot between how much can we give away without sort of violating, confidentiality and anonymity. So that's kind of what we're working with, and it's trying to identify all these little bits that maybe could be a risk. That's, I think, one of the biggest challenges as well, is just trying to make sure that we cover every base and make sure it's completely anonymous.
Brilliant. Thank you, Connor. Thank you for sharing all that, and best of luck with data set 2 and the rest of your research. I was going to move on now to talk a little bit about our online data analytics and social statistics course. But before I do that, could I pass over to Alex just to tell us maybe a little bit about how some of the topics we've talked about today on open data and things could maybe link to the course that you run here at the University of Manchester, and things that people might be able to study on this course?
Yeah, thanks for that. So yeah, when we developed this master's program, the idea was to think what are the skills that people need to work with data and work with traditional data like surveys, but also with new forms of data like digital trace data. So we cover, things like programming, using R, for example, to do work with complicated data, working with text data and things like that. We cover more conceptual things about how to collect data, different types of data, biases. We also talk about digital trace data and issues with that. And then also modeling. So things like machine learning, structure equation modeling, so combination of traditional stats models and kind of more newer, more exciting models. So the idea was to build up the skills so you can work with this kind of data like the one we are working on in this project.
Brilliant. Cheers for that, Alex. Thank you. Yeah, so if this is something that you're interested in doing as a study option, the University of Manchester launched a couple of years ago now our Data Analytics and Social Statistics Online MSc, or also it's available as a postgraduate diploma. So this is an online part-time master's degree. So you can study alongside your other commitments. Probably most of you are in full-time employment. So the idea is to study alongside that and get a master's degree in the field of data analytics and social statistics. The course runs for 27 months if you're on the master's route, or 18 months if you're doing the postgraduate diploma. And for this, you can study part-time. So we recommend around 15 to 20 hours of study time per week. That includes lectures, tutorials, reading, independent research. So it's the sort of thing you can balance alongside your full-time work. We have an intake in September 2025. I believe it'll be our third intake. Alex can
Yep.
correct me if I'm wrong on that. Yeah, so it'd be a third intake for this online program. So the course is nicely established now, and there's quite a lot of people already studying the course. So you'll have a lot of people alongside you doing this course. Currently, we do offer a few fee discounts available, so you can look at our course website for more information on that, or you can get in touch with me, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have about the course. So my email can be found there at studyonline@manchester.ac.uk. You can also visit our course webpage at manchester.ac.uk/social data to get a bit more information about the course. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have, so you can email me. We can also arrange a quick meeting, a phone call consultation to learn more about the course if you would prefer, and I'd be happy to do that. I'll just quickly run a short poll based on what we've talked about today. So I'll just launch that now. If our participants would like to just take a moment to fill in that, just a couple of questions. And if you're interested in the course, just let me know and give me an email, or I'll get in touch with you as well. I think we've managed to answer everyone's questions there. So if you do think of any other questions later that you'd like to ask Alex or Connor, you can also email them across to me and I can pass those on. But I think we're pretty much coming to the end of our time. So yeah, I'll just finish off by saying a big thank you to Alex and Connor. A big thank you to everyone who's joined us in our audience today, and all those questions were very insightful. And thank you for all your answers, guys. And yeah, we'll finish there. And best of luck with the research, Connor. And if you need any more information about studying here at the University of Manchester, just get in touch with me at studyonline@manchester.ac.uk. So bye for now, and thanks for joining. See you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Yeah.